Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and this box that you see here in front of us is it's a bin of African night crawlers. And they're the African night crawlers I got from Gaetano, and this system's been in service now for 222 days. And during that entire time, this little batch of material, actually I might be mistaken, this might have come in a little bit after the launch of the bin, but you know, for the basic purposes of talking about what's in here, it is fair to say that over the almost the entire life of this bin, this stuff's been in here, giving all these little bits of material an opportunity to get approached and consumed by the worms. And even before the stuff was placed into here, it had been floating around in the previous environment that these worms in here inhabited. So this stuff even predates this bin. And I think I've been more than generous in terms of allowing an opportunity for the stuff to get possibly broken down if it was a material that was capable of having that happen to it in a worm bin. But I think I've already for some time now come to the determination that that's not going to happen. It was for that reason we took it out of where it had normally been kept, and it was normally kept right down in the feeding area. In this case, the feeding area was where you see this piece of coffee filter positioned to indicate to ourselves where we last fed, just to be able to find our way back there pretty quickly. At this point, our so-called feeding zone indicator is probably not useful for much else than supplementary bedding at some point. But back to the bag here. We already decided a while ago that it was time to just call this experiment quits. And that's the reason the stuff is sitting in this bag here. And the idea was that if we gave it enough time, then the material would dry enough to be able to simply pass through this mesh bag that it's contained in. And then what would be left behind would be the material that we've been attempting to isolate from the finished casting. So we had already hinted at the fact that this was a long overdue activity, and I'm just kind of starting into it now. I'm just giving the whole thing a shake until such a time that all the castings inside pass through the screen. And I can already see a couple fragments of this stuff coming through, and I should probably collect them as I spot them. Otherwise, they're just going to get buried by the ongoing dispersion of the material that's passing through the screen. But I think you get the idea here. It's not rocket science. It's a pretty simple concept. And the only thing preventing me from actually pulling the trigger on doing it was the dampness of the stuff in the bag. So that's the reason it was left out on the surface, to give it time to dry through. And it still feels cool to the touch, so there's still moisture content in here. I didn't really expect it to go completely dry, although I suppose the chance of that did exist, just being so exposed to the air out in the open. So yeah, I think more and more of this stuff is starting to shake loose as smaller and smaller pieces become revealed. Now, you know, I had another idea, and it's right here, so why don't I bring it in? I have this other bag. It's part of this much larger onion bag. It was like, I don't even remember what size this was. I was doing some help at the scout home, cutting vegetables. I've already fed some of the cauliflower scraps that I bought home from that little volunteer session. I've also got some shredded carrot peels. Carrot peels, not shreds. So at some point I'll be utilizing that stuff too, but here again, the bag itself is also something that I commandeered while I was there helping out, thinking that maybe some of the material on that bag would be useful. Because it's almost the same as what you see here, but it also has this diagonal stripe to it, so the holes are quite a bit smaller in this material than this stuff. So it does seem like maybe I can use that as a secondary capture mechanism. Hopefully everything that I'm shaking through this bag is small enough to possibly even go through the smaller screen. But, you know, this might enable me to breeze through this a little bit more quickly and not worry so much about individual little pieces making their way through the bag. We'll just catch them in the next layer. So I did, you might have noticed that bag had pieces of sticker on it and plastic and labels and everything like that, but this was a pretty good sized piece that I was able to remove from the bottom. and unfold it and take off the tape holding it together and so forth. So it's almost like just a perfect piece of material here. There's a little bit of the tape still obscuring a few of the holes on maybe ½ an inch in, but for the most part it seems like good sturdy material that I might be able to fashion a slightly more dense, smaller screen, finer screen, because what I use regularly is one that has pretty good size openings on it, my screening bucket contraption, and I'm still kind of brainstorming on how I might be able to use this piece of material here, or even more of the material that's still part of the main bag that I didn't chop up yet. Maybe see if I can come up with some sort of interesting screening mechanism that's slightly better, or well, different in the perspective that it's able to capture much smaller objects and separate them from the castings. And the one got you with all that is that, you know, your castings do need to break down, or no, yeah, I guess break down and dry out to the point where they're capable of making their way through such a fine material. So I guess we're probably getting to a point where maybe everything that was gonna fall through has fallen through. We can take a little preview of what we got here, and maybe this doesn't need to be a perfect example either, but I think we've kind of achieved what we were after here. So maybe we can even just do this little sort out over here too. So here I'm seeing more and more bits that did manage to sneak through, whether a long ways. A piece like this just wouldn't have gone through on its own if it didn't somehow go through the long way, which is always a little bit less likely to happen than just a smaller piece that is capable in pretty much any orientation to make it through. So I'm assuming that the most of the stuff that we're going to see falling through is the smaller varieties. Although the stuff really does hold together well, and I'm seeing less of that small fragment stuff than I thought I would. And it makes sense now that I think about it, because the stuff just, you know, never really got to the point where it would break down. It just stayed in place and still has that unusual springiness to it. Oh, wow, that was interesting. It's sort of delaminated from itself, which I've not yet seen. So it's not even just a single layer, it's multiple layers of stretchy material that doesn't want to break down. So I think we're almost at the point where we can call this little attempt complete. And even this doesn't need to occur right now, you know. I could pick around with this a little bit later. We can just keep these things sort of in their respective holders. Perhaps if we were to shake this here a little more, we'd actually get some of the material that is fine enough to even pass through that finer mesh. And at that point, we would probably get little or no springy, stretchy material. But at this point, I gotta say, it feels kind of good to be through with that stuff. And I guess I could have just thrown a good batch of castings away, but to me it seemed like an interesting challenge. How do I get myself to that point where I can, you know, do it if I had to? And even though I didn't have to, it was still a cool exercise, I think, to say, you know, hey, you're going to need to let the material progress to a certain dryness level before you can do this, or oh, naturally you got to let a little time happen and the worms leave. All those two things sort of work together hand in hand to a certain point. And then there's just the density of the mesh. Luckily, the original red bag that we started with already got things down to almost the perfect size, but it was kind of cool to be able to bump into that additional red mesh material that's even finer. And I think it might even open the door to me having an improved screening gadget soon. All right, let's get to feeding these little guys. Now, the other thing I kind of overlooked last time we were in here was the fact that we had experimented with some cheese. I had a slice of super dry Swiss cheese, completely dried out. Took it out of the refrigerator thinking, oh, maybe I can make a sandwich out of this. And it wouldn't even bend, it wouldn't budge. So they got it 2 feedings ago at this point. The last feeding 12 days ago was more just veggies. I think coffee, yeah, it was letter C was persistent. There was coffee, which often is part of my feedings. There was chow. No corn that time though, even though this what we have here is a little piece of corn cob. there was something about this little piece, even though it seemed kind of small, it was just so encapsulated in castings that I couldn't resist taking a peek inside, and wouldn't you know it, the worms are in there. So it was cabbage, coffee, and chow. So all those items with the letter C. And I'm expecting that some of the cheese, which was also letter C, but not last feeding, but 2 feedings ago, at this point, there too, I don't remember the interval, if there was 12 times between this and the last feeding, plus whatever interval between the previous 2 feedings, were probably close to a month. I'm pretty sure these are maybe chunks of paper. You know, I guess what I'm looking for is not only the Swiss cheese, which has probably been gone for a while, but the fake cheese. So besides the Swiss cheese, we threw in a couple slices of this non-dairy fake cheese, as I've been referring to it. It just didn't seem like it was going anywhere. We found traces of it last time, and I couldn't even identify it. What an airhead I am sometimes. Now I feel like I want to experiment with all these corn cob bits, because it seems like the worms have definitely taken to this stuff. It's going to be history soon. So it's kind of cool checking in on this bin. There's so many worms hanging out in it. Look at them all. Holy moly. Alright, we need a bigger hole in this because I got a pretty good amount of food. Once again, cabbage, more letter C. Once again, coffee, more letter C. But I got plums. What else do I have over there? We'll take a closer look once we feed, but I'm going to give these guys a moment to retreat, and then we'll start piling this stuff in. Since it's frozen, I'd prefer to see no worms visible, so I feel okay putting frozen stuff in. All right, so I gotta say, the weight of this thing is substantial. There's a good amount of stuff in here. I mean, it's not just a regular plum. I think it's like an emperor plum or something like that. These things are huge. And they're going in with the seed inside. We'll just pull the seeds out at some later time. This is 2 paper towels or 4 paper towels, I forget. Another portion of coffee, similar to the last feeding. So they're getting more coffee and more cabbage, as I mentioned earlier. This here is like broccoli rabe stems, and I got some worm chow we can include, and I got some fresh bedding we can include. So why don't we start with that? We'll just grab a handful of my prepared bedding to sprinkle the bottom of the hole with, further giving me that peace of mind that I'm not going to freeze out any little wormies who might be just under the surface. They'll feel some cold, and they can approach it as they like. But then again, stuff probably doesn't stay frozen too long in the worm bin. Yeah, look at the size of these things. And they're tasty too. So now before we get too covered up over here, I think we can sprinkle in a little bit of my worm chow. I just made a whole big batch of it. And I ground it further, I don't know, a little bit further than I usually do. So it's got a much more powdery, dusty kind of consistency now. And then I think we can start piling in the other stuff. The other thing that I like to somehow do, if possible, is, you know, kind of cool putting the worm chow right onto this bedding material, so it's got stuff to mix in with. But then I always think the coffee is similar, being that, you know, minuscule in nature. Little itsy bitsy pieces. Combine it with some other stuff. Probably help all of it get eaten up more quickly. New feeding zone indicator. Alright, you know what? We got those paper towels, but I don't know. Got so much more food here too still. So why don't we get this stuff going in here too. All right. These are the sort of things that you don't expect to see last in the worm bin, you know. Whole bunch of leafy stuff. Even these things are probably pretty much liquid, fluid. I mean, not much to it. I'm going to give them a little bit of grit to go along with the feeding as well. So we've given bedding, we've given grit to go with the food. The food even included some of my worm chow. And anytime you put stuff like this in, pieces of paper, this is all just supplementary bonus bedding for them. And wasn't there a piece of feeding zone indicator paper to be recycled? I thought we had stashed it over here, but maybe we already threw it in. I don't remember. Oh, is it here? There it is. Cool. Yeah, this is where we stacked up those little bits of corn cob too. Let's put those back in. All right, looking good, looking good. What a nice bin. Lots and lots of wormies in here. We didn't even check out the outer edges yet. Something I've been trying to get in the habit of doing. Sometimes it used to seem like I would go feedings, many feedings, and only then, sometimes lasting months in between those multiple feedings, I would finally get around to checking the outer edges of my systems, but I think it's important to keep tabs on that stuff too. Mainly for the reason of possibly letting it get dry out there if your coverings are not thorough enough or whatever the case may be. Out there, there's also a lot of times just a high concentration of, you know, castings only. It seems like, hey, if worms are going to be hanging out in there, maybe take some, you know, stuff that could use some attention and sprinkle it in there instead of it just being, you know, castings only. Let it be castings plus stuff the worms could be nibbling on while they're there. Yeah, you know, here and there I feel like I encounter a little tiny chunk of something that seems like it might be kind of clumping up, but as soon as I touch it, it just, you know, busts up into bitty pieces, making me think that I think we're in pretty good shape as far as moisture goes. I guess that's the reason I am probing it, because it does feel so damp. I just don't want it to get to that next stage of being muddy. But all of it just flows really loosely, nice and crumbly stuff. Even when I encounter something large, it's usually got some sort of a large object inside of it, like this piece of corn cob. Otherwise, it's got no business being in large chunks. Stuff just doesn't really stick to itself. That's the consistency you want. You know, still doing that while already feeling borderline too damp. And that's what this seems like, you know. You touch the stuff and you're like, oh, isn't this too damp? It turns out no. Incredible stuff when it's at the right moisture level. All right. Well, kind of neat that we've got ourselves a replacement feeding zone indicator. And I think we can start putting stuff back, but we're not going to be putting back this. This I'll shake out further, but that's nothing to see because I think we already confirmed for the most part there's no worms in this stuff. So we're not abandoning any wormies, and for that matter, I'll put the plastic covering on later because I'm going to leave that stuff on the plastic covering. In the meantime, this stuff will be safe. But I figured I'd end the video here and, you know, save all the mundane, boring stuff for off camera. But before I go, really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.